So, hello, and welcome to today's part 2 of the building a full stack capstone app from scratch. So today's topic, or this session's topic to be specific, is going to be unit testing. Now, for the purpose of this, since we will be doing unit testing, I'm just using the finished capstone, but without the tests. So notice how there's no test folder, but basically this is just a clone of the full-blown just Jotted app that has all the tests, and you can access that just removing the testing from the link. Which, by the way, this link I'm just going to share with you guys with via the chat. So you know what? Let me do it right now. Let me send you guys the link, and it will be attached on the YouTube recording once I submit it. So let's get started. So this assumes we have absolutely no test, no setup whatsoever, so we can begin testing. So let's begin. Our first goal before we can begin testing would be to create the test folder where our tests will live. So let's create a test folder, and once that's set up, we can start creating our tests. So before we can do that, we need to make sure we have Mocha and Chai installed. So let's install them right now. So let's do npm install Mocha and Chai. And also, because we will be relying on HTTP testing, we want to use the Chai HTTP plugin, which is called Chai HTTP. And basically, if you check it out, you can find that it's available via npm, and we can install it via npm. Just let's search for Chai HTTP, and yeah, it's called exactly that, Chai-HTTP. So let's do that right now, Chai-HTTP. And oh, we forgot to install the actual Chai package as well. There we go. That should be all we need, I think. So let's begin. Now, while that's installing, let's start creating our test files. So our first test would probably have to be, like, if you notice our application structure, there's probably 3 core things we want to test. We want to test our routers for authentication router, or node router, and or user router. So in order to do so, we need to create tests for all those 3 routes, and let's not forget the most important one. Let's make sure we test server.js as well. So let's begin with server.js, because that's probably the easier one. So let's start running a test for that. So let's create a new file and start it. Let's call it server.test.js to be very explicit with the naming convention. And let's begin by requiring both plugins we will be using. So we will be using Chai and Chai HTTP plugins. So I'm having an issue. Let me format document. Nope. Fix all fixable problems. I think that should do it. I think. Huh. I guess because of the line breaks. There we go. Yeah, just excuse me. It's a minor issue. So we imported our Chai plugin and Chai HTTP plugin because we will be using both extensively. Now, let's begin creating the most simple test of them all to begin with, because that often helps just clarify a lot of the questions of how Chai works and Mocha works. So let's start by adding a describe block. And here we basically write a definition of these tests. So we're just going to write integration tests for, and then slash, which is a server.js, right? And then we pass in a function, which is where all tests will be run. Now, our next step was to create a test. So let's create the most simple test of them all. It should be true, and then inside of the function, let's write the most basic test of them all, which would be, I think we actually forgot one minor step. We normally would have to type something like chai.expect, but that's very verbose. You don't want to have to do that every single time. So to fix that, we're just going to add a new shorthand syntax like so. Const expect equals chai.expect. And that's it. So now we can use expect without having to type chai. Let's do expect true dot to be, or no, to equal true. And that should pass, right? It's just a super straightforward test. To run these, you have to check your package.json and set a test script. So I already have it right here, but for you, basically, yours would look like this. And if it already has a test one, then just delete it and add a new one. It could be that same one. So you just name it test, and you would write something like this, Mocha. So just add the word Mocha, and that will run. Basically, Mocha automatically runs all the tests inside of your test folder. So that's why you should always be writing test inside of a test folder in your project's root. Okay, that's pretty much it. So let's run this test. Let's try running test via npm test, and there we go. It's passing. Cool. So far we're doing good. Now let's actually do something serious. Let's not just test some random boolean true to be true. Let's actually run the server. Now to do that, if you go to my app, my actual server, you'll notice that the way I have it configured, I have two methods called, one's called start server, the other one's called stop server. So I can use these two to start and stop my server before every test. And that's exactly what I am going to do. So I'm going to do that right now. So let's add a before and after hook. Now, before I move on, let's clarify. The reason why we can do this describe and it's because these variables or functions are provided by Mocha or test runner. So Mocha is what you're using to run the test. That's a test runner. While Chai functions as the assertion library, or basically what allows you to do the actual testing, like the tool that you use for testing. So you need both to work in tandem to do efficient testing. You need Mocha to run the test, and you need Chai to actually do the testing. So once that's cleared up, let's use some of Mocha's hooks that make testing easier. So for example, one of Mocha's hooks is called before. So when you write a before hook, all it means is this function you just wrote is going to be run before all the it blocks in this scope. So that makes it super helpful so that we can start the server before every test, right? So that makes it super easy to start and stop a server. So here, let's do return start server. And now, because this is a testing server, we're going to pass start server true. Now, this is of course throwing an error because I haven't imported my start server. So let's do that right now. Let's import, let's go to here. Let's do const, and let's import our start server, or stop server, and our app from app.server.js. The syntax is go up 2 levels, go into app, and then find server.js. So we're in test, go up a level, go into app, and then server.js, right? So that's set up. Now this should be working as expected. I passed through to make sure I'm using the testing server. The way I have my code set up, if I show you my server file. So notice how start server in this case, it has notice how start server has a parameter called test environment, and if it is true, it says the Mongo URL to the test Mongo URL. Otherwise, it uses the development URL. So to show you what the URL looks like, right here. So notice how when I do local development, I use my database called just jot it, but when I am testing, I create a new database called test-just jot it. Otherwise, I will probably be deleting the data I have in my development server. So you don't want to do that. You want to use a separate server, depending on if you're running tests or if you're doing local testing. Okay, cool. Now that's set up. Now let's make sure we also shut down the server after each test, because you want. This is the reason why we do this. Like you might be thinking. Why we need to shut down the server after all the tests is because you want Mocha to automatically start the server and automatically shut it down when it exits, just so that there's nothing left running. So let's do that right now. Let's do return stop server, and that should work. That's our server starting and stopping. The reason why we do a return is because Mocha doesn't know when your tests have finished running. So it might run this line and assume everything is done. But starting a server takes time. It's not instantaneous. So it happens actually asynchronously. So if you don't give Mocha a promise, it won't wait until your code is done executing. And because this code takes a while to run, you need to return the promise to Mocha, so it waits for the code to run. Don't believe me there's a promise? Let's take a look at the start server code. So if you look at this code, notice how we are returning a promise. So that's set up. Now let's actually do the testing, right? Let's write our first test in a more maybe more functional manual, let's write a test called should return index.html. Why? Because I have my server hooked up so that by default when I enter /index or just slash, it should return my index.html page. So let's test that. Let's test that theory. So to be able to test HTTP servers, you need to make sure you're using chai via the HTTP plugin. So to do that, you need to implement it via the chai.use at the top. So here, when you're just importing it, you want to do this. So chai.use HTTP, and that basically tells chai, hey, please use the HTTP plugin to help us test today. So that's set up. Once that's done, our next step is to actually write the test. So our test would go a bit like this. We would begin by writing a chai.request. So let's do that. Chai.request. And then we pass in, this is key. In order to chai to fake a request to your server, you have to pass it the app object. And that's something that you also export from your server. The app is the actual Express app. So if you take a look at my server, notice how I created here, const app express.js, but at the end, here modulo exports, I'm exporting my app, okay? So that's it up. So I do chai.request to the app, and then I'm going to make a get request to the slash route. And then once that is executed, I get a response object as a parameter. Now, what am I going to test? Well, let's do some simple tests. Let's do something like expect response to have, I don't know, I forgot. Let's say I have no idea how to use chai HTTP testing. So that's where you would first use the documentation to test it out. So to test it out, you check out the official site for chai HTTP. Let's scroll down to the assertions we can do. And these are the assertions. And there we have. Here's one we can do, to have status. So we can do tests like to have status, to have headers, to be an IP, to be JSON, HTML, or text, stuff like that. So it's really cool that Chai allows us to do all these tests thanks to the Chai HTTP plugin. So let's do that. Let's do to have status of OK, which I think is the 200. Then let's also make sure our response to be.html, right? It needs to be HTML. And then last but not least, this is just a paranoia check. Inside the response.text, that's where the actual content of the response is. So let's check that inside of it, it has the string that represents HTML, which is the one that says something like this, doc type HTML. Okay, that looks like that should work. Let's run it and let's see what happens. So let's do npm test, and let's see, there we go, it's running, it's starting our server. There we go, that's passing. Now, that's not very exciting. Like, it's working, but it would be cool if you could see why that was working. And for that, we're going to debug it. Now, I already covered debugging in one of my workshops, but I'm just going to give a quick intro into it. So I'm going to go to the debugger. I don't have any configurations now, so I'm just going to click on the gear. It asks me if it's a Node or Chrome configuration because I have the Node Chrome debugging plugin installed. So I'm just going to select Node. And then it creates a default configuration for me. Now, this would allow me to debug a Node project that had an index.js file, but that's useless to me. I don't want to debug that. I want to debug my tests. And to write that configuration, I could do so, but it would take some time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to Google, type VS Code Mocha debugging, and I'm going to use Microsoft official configuration for Mocha, just to make this easy for me. So here it is. Just going to copy, paste it, and I have Mocha configuration now. There we go. So see how now I have these two configuration objects. Now I'm going to click on Mocha all, but before I do, I'm going to add a breakpoint. So to do that, I can do it either by writing the word debugger, which I'm going to do now because I feel that's faster and easier. So there we go. I'm running my test this time via VS Code, not via the terminal. And that should get them to stop once it reaches this debugger. There we go, it's stopping. Now let's check how this response looks like and see why it's passing. So if we check response in the debugger console, we can see that the response definitely has a status code of 200. That's why that test passes. Let's run the next line. Is the response HTML? I don't know. Is it? Yes, it is. It is of type HTML, and you can see it clearly in the type. And does response.text have the string .type HTML inside of it? Let's check it out. Yeah, it does. So it looks like we're good. It looks like our tests are running exactly as they should be. So let's just let this run, and let's just continue with the other test, because I think this is all we can test for the server.js. So let's just save that, and let's continue with our next test, which would be, how about we test, I think it might make sense to test the user router next, because that's what we need to have tested before we can move on with our authentication and notes. So let's write user.test.js. And I'm just going to copy paste a lot of the code I will be reusing just to speed this thing up, because we are short on time. So there we go. So this time we'll be using Mongoose, ChatGPT, and Faker. Now the newcomers here are Mongoose, which you might be wondering, why do we need Mongoose? And it's because it makes testing easier if you can use the Mongoose to directly do stuff with it to test the user endpoint. And Faker is an NPM plugin that we want to use to mock databases and mock user information. So if we go to Faker NPM, this is actually a library that allows you to create massive amounts of fake data for the browser or even Node.js, and it has a ton of methods like faker.address, and it allows you to create fake addresses, zip codes, cities, street names, street addresses. It's divided by categories like commerce, colors, departments, product name, companies, databases, dates, finance, hacker, helpers, images, internet email, internet avatar, internet URL. It's insane what you can do with this. So yeah, that's Faker. Let's also, to make this easier for us, let's also import what we'll be using, which is we import the start and stop server. We import the user model, which we will be testing as well for as part of your user route. And to make our status code game easier, I actually defined a configuration property in my config, because I have terrible memory. I'm not very good at remembering what's the status code for what. So I just create an object with all the most common ones and name them accordingly. Like the 200 means okay, 201 means created, 204 means no content, etc. So this makes it just super easy for me. So whatever. Let's continue with our test. So let's make sure we have our chai plugin configured. So there we go. That's set up. It's doing it's making expect easier to use, and then setting it up so we can use ChatGPT. Now let's begin with a test, typing out the usual. So let's name it scribe, and let's name it integration tests for, and this time we're going to test our API/user route. Let's add a function, and inside of here, because it's also going to be requiring the server to be running before and after, let's add the before hook, which I'm sure you're all familiar with already, and the after hook. So that's just for stopping and starting the server. Okay, good. Now here it's going to be kind of interesting, because now because we're dealing with actual data, you want to mock data, and you want to create mock data every single time you create a test, and also delete the entire database. And we're going to do that right now. So we're going to add a new hook called the before each hook. Now this sounds similar to the before hook, right? Like, what's the difference between before each and before? And it's quite clear. Before runs before all of the it test blocks that we have at this level, while before each runs before each it test block. So it runs a lot more frequently. Yeah, so that's it up. Now let's clarify what's going on before all our tests, because this is important for our test run. So before we do every single test, we're actually creating a faker user. Now, if that doesn't make sense, it's probably because I haven't created that function yet, which I'm going to do right now. And you know what? I'm going to do it right here. So let's, at the start of the test, let's create our create faker user. Actually missed. There we go. So create faker user, all this does, it returns a new dynamically generated fake user that gets stored into the database, and I'm using faker for that. So I'm going to create a fake user's name using faker.name.firstname plus the faker.name last name. Then the username is going to be just a faker.lauren.word, a random word, and then a faker.random.number that's between a 0 and 100. So that's it up. Password is also the same, random faker internet password and random faker internet email. And basically what I'm doing before each test is using my user model that I just imported right here. I'm going to create a new test user just for the sake of actually using this in case I need it. And then once that's done, I need to also make sure that after each test, I delete my entire database. Why would I do that? You might be wondering. And the reason is simple. Unit testing is all about testing the smallest unit of functionality possible. And tests should be run in a sanitized environment as clean as possible, because that way, if things go wrong, you know it's because the functionality is broken, not because some other test affected another test. So tests that affect each other are crazy hard to troubleshoot and debug. That's why we want to make sure every single test runs in a clean new environment. So after each test, we're going to return a new promise, and inside of it, we're going to literally drop the entire database. Okay? So yeah, we're serious. We delete the entire database after every single test. And once that's done, we're ready to start testing. So our first test is going to be checking that it returns all the users. So it's going to be something like this. So let's go to the bottom. Let's add our first test. So our first test goes something like this. Request to make a new request to our app express server to the API/user get route. And then if it goes okay, we want to check that the response has a status code of okay, which remember, this is a property of a number. So okay is 200. Okay. And then we check that because this should return users, it should be a JSON object, right? So we check for that. And you know what? Why am I telling you this? I should just show you, right? So how about we add a debugger breakpoint right about here, save it. Let's make sure we don't have any debuggers here. Yeah, we don't. And let's run the tests. Let's click mock all, and let's see this test in action so you can see why it's actually running. So let's have it run. Come on, come on, come on. There we go. So you can see that the response has status indeed of 200. So this is going to pass. Then the response does have a type of application/JSON. So it is going to pass this one as well. And then we check the response.body that it is an array. So this test is also passing that it is an array. And then we check other things like the request body to have at least one item in it. We can definitely confirm that is true. And then last but not least, we make sure that inside of one of these objects inside the body, we do have a valid user that has things like the ID, name, username, and email. Let's check that out. Here's body. Here's the first item. There's email, ID, name, and username. So this definitely passes. And finally, this is something I added just to be like more secure. You should never return the user's passwords, no matter what API endpoint you're building. So I made sure that it doesn't include the keys for password. And we can also confirm that there's no password in sight. Okay? So yeah, that's our first test, and it runs pretty good. Let's continue with the next ones, which would be something a bit more advanced, which would be should return a specific user. So this one, I'm going to add it right here. Now, it's kind of similar because this endpoint, all I'm doing is doing the same check I did above. So I'm also making a request to API/user to get all users. Then I'm, unlike the previous case, I'm going to immediately do chai.request to app and fetch, this time only that user. So I'm going to fetch a user directly from the endpoint to see if this endpoint works. So to test that, I just make a new request. So basically I'm chaining to a request. Here's where it gets interesting and where I'm seeing some students have to struggle. I made a request here, but then because this returns all the users, I can then extract just one user called found user from the body, and then I use that found user's ID to make a new request. but this time to the /API/user/user ID endpoint. Okay, and you know what? I should have showed you that. So let me just add a debugger breakpoint, and let's debugger here. Let's allow it to run. So it's going to first find them all, get one, gets its ID, and then make a new request. Let's see that in action soon. And as soon as that loads, just give it a second. There we go. So if I let it play, I added a new breakpoint on line 98 now. Click on continue. So now you can see that this time our found user is just the first item inside of the request.body. So here's our found user. It extracts it, and then it uses the found user's ID to make any request. If I click play, it's going to return once the request has returned. And notice how this time the request also returned as a success. So the status code is 200, type is JSON, and inside the text we have definitely a valid user. So we can see that request.body is definitely an object, request.body ID. Here's where we make the final test. We verify the ID of that user matches the original user we found. And if it does, it passes all the tests. To compare that, I'm going to do something cool. I'm going to use the debug console to literally check that out. So response.body ID and found user ID. As you can see, they're completely equal. Don't believe me? That's true. So that's why our tests are passing. All right. And finally, we test the final endpoint, which is user creation. So that one's going to look a bit like this one. So let's add it. So it should create a new user. So this time, instead of relying on the user that was already created, we create a new user with Faker. Then let me add a debug breakpoint there and just show you that as well. So we create a new user. It makes a request, this time a post request to /API/user. Then it sends the new user as part of the data payload. So let me just move these breakpoints that I added. There we go. So first things, create a Faker new user. So right now it's undefined because this line hasn't run yet. But once it runs, here's our Faker user. So that's our fake user. We make a post request to this. If it succeeds, it reaches this point. And here's where we make all of these checks, like a response status code of created, which is the 201. That matches. That's going to be a success. Is the response a JSON? Yes, it is, as usual. Then we check things that we already did, like the response body to be an object and to include the keys ID, name, username, and email. And then, at the cherry on top, to actually check that the creation went well, we verified that inside of that, because when you create a new user, it responds the actual user created. We compare if the returned user matches the original new user we created at the start on line 109. And if it does, it passes the test. And as we can see here, it definitely matches all of them. So email is Kylie.welchi and Kylie.welchi. And username is Quaya. I have no idea how to pronounce that, 28. And then Quaya 28. So our tests all run as expected and they succeed as they should. So that's a user test. Now let's get to the authentication ones, which can be the trickiest ones in some occasions. So let's go over authentication test. So let's create a new authentication test. So let's do auth.test.js. Let's copy all the boilerplate we're very familiar with. So this includes things like Mongoose, Chai, ChatGPT, Faker, the status codes. But look, there's something new. We are now importing the JSON Web Token plugin. So we're using that plugin to make sure we can create valid JSON Web Tokens, and also make sure you have all of these installed. So just to be safe, I'm going to do npm install Faker and JSON Web Token. There we go. And once we have those installed, we're ready to start writing our tests. So first test would be something like describe integration test for API/auth. Now that's that set up. Let's, oops, I made a mistake. Don't be like me. Don't use error functions in Mocha. They, at least for describe blocks and the before and it blocks, you should never use them. Mocha doesn't support them. I found this out the hard way. So functions should always be used, like the full function syntax for the describe blocks, the mocha hooks like before each, and after, as well as the it blocks, but you can use them for the actual request. Okay, now let's just copy the usual. So let's copy all the hooks, and we can just go over them super quick. So here's all the hooks. So our first hook is self-explanatory, starting the server. Our final hook, shutting down the server. And our after each hook, just deleting the entire database. So why does that before each hook look so complex, right? It definitely looks quite complex, and let's figure out why. Before that, let me just create these two globals, which I will be using quite a lot. You will see soon enough why. So the reason why I am doing all of this before each is because I want to test authentication. And to do so, I need to have a user created. And I can do that by just directly doing it using the Mongoose model. So I'm going to do user.hashpassword. Once that's created, I then do user.create. And using the created test user with faker, I do user.create and then insert the email username from the test user. But in password, I don't store the actual password. I store the hashed password, because that's the way, remember, hashing is all about never storing the real password. You store a hash of it, an encrypted hash of it. Now that that's set up, you then create a user, and if it is corrected successfully, I attach from the created user's ID, I attach it to my test user, because I will be using that quite a bit. And then also, notice how I create my JSON Web Token by doing the JSON Web Token plugin, using its sign method, and basically I'm creating my own JSON Web Tokens. This is something no user should be capable of doing. The reason why we can do it is because we have access to our own code. So we have access to the JWT secret, we have access to our JWT expiry, we have access to the exact module that generated them. So we're safe. We can actually create them no problem. So I create my JSON Web Token like so, and I will use this JSON Web Token to actually test my endpoints. So let's actually start writing tests, because I think that's where things are just going to start clicking. Okay, so let's write our first test, which is going to be the login endpoint. So the login endpoint is going to be testing. Excuse me for that. So the login endpoint is going to test that we should be able to log in correctly and return a valid JSON Web Token. So to test that out, let's add our first test right here. So that's our first test. I actually made a mistake. I forgot to copy over or create faker user function. That's why it's probably throwing an error here. So I'm going to add our function right here. There we go. So there's a create faker user. There we go. So this should work. Now let's examine our first test, which will be should log in correctly and return a valid JSON Web Token. So it makes a post request to our API/auth/login. And we're going to try to log in with the test user we already created in a database, okay? So it's going to do that, and if you don't believe me, I'm just going to add a new breakpoint here, as before. So it makes a request to log in using the username and password that are already registered. And then it's going to check if the login was successful. So for example, right now, before I'm trying to log in, because the before each already ran before the test, we know we have test user. There we go. There's a test user, named Grover or Casper. So if we look at our database with Robot3T, if I go to our collections, users, there's Grover or Casper. So it definitely created our test user. So we're going to try to log in with our credentials. So we try to log in with the test username and test password. And if everything goes according to plan, these should all pass, as we can see. Now here's where it gets interesting. If it was successful, then the request body should have the JWT token as part of it, which it does. And then here's where it gets a bit crazy. We want to verify that the JSON Web Token is valid. To do so, we use the JSON Web Tokens method called verify, and to .verify we pass in the included JSON Web Token, the JWT secret, and the algorithm. And basically, if it is valid, then JWT payload evaluates to an object. That basically, this is all the information that was extracted from the JSON Web Token. And that's pretty cool, if you ask me. So all of this information was encrypted instead of this JSON Web Token. So once it's decrypted, then we check out the payload that was inside of it. And we check out that the payload's user matches the user that we just tried to log in with. And if it does, we can consider that this login was 100% successful, which it was. So those are our tests for this endpoint. And then last but not least, let's just quickly go over how the refresh endpoint works, because that one's a bit trickier, but at the same time, it's more of the same. So the refreshing endpoint is going to work a bit like this. So unlike the previous one, we first decode the first JWT payload we got, because the refresh mechanism is all about just generating the same JSON Web Token, but moving the expiry date ahead of time so that it doesn't expire as soon. So we first declare de-encrypt the first JSON Web Token payload. So this JWT token, remember that one, we generated all the way in or before each block, before all the tests. So this already exists as a global, okay? So that's generated that way. And then our test decrypts it and then stores it into first JWT payload. Then we do the call to the API/auth/request. We make sure, because this one does require JWT authentication, so we set the authorization to the bearer JWT token. And then the usual checks, check that it does have a JSON Web Token, decode the payload of the JSON Web Token provided, and then we do the check we did previously, that it should include the test user's username, email, and name, but this is what we want to care about. So here, what we're doing is we're comparing the expiration date, that the new JSON Web Token payload expiry date is at least the expiry date of the first JSON Web Token payload. The expiry date is basically just a date number, so it basically has to match. So if you're refreshing the token, you should get a newer token, right? And that's what this check does. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much all for authentication. Let's just run all the tests just to make sure we're not screwing anything up before we move to the node tests, which should be the easiest ones to test, to be honest, because authentication was what made this challenging. But after authentication is covered, it's literally just a cakewalk, to be honest. Yeah, there we go. All tests are passing. Now let's add a new node router test file. Let's add all the boilerplate that we are used to using, and let's see, there's something new. Yes, we are importing the user and the node model. Why the user, you might be wondering? Like, we're only testing the node router, right? And well, not exactly, and let me tell you why. So let's start by describing first our test block. So it's going to be integration tests for API/node function, and then let's copy all our hooks, which we will be using quite extensively. And also let's make sure we have our create faker methods. And this time we will need two of them. We will create two faker methods called create faker user and create faker node. So you might be wondering, okay, creating nodes is easy, right? It's just creating fake nodes. But why do we need to create faker users? Hold on to that thought. So the before method, that's self-explanatory. We need to start the server before all the tests. Same thing as the after each, where we stop the server after all the tests, and the after each, where we shut down the database after every test. The before each all the tests is where it gets interesting. The reason why you need to create a test user, basically, before you test a node endpoint, is because if you remember the way we coded our endpoints from part 1 of this course series, all the endpoints for nodes are protected, and they require you to be logged in. So to be logged in, you need to have a valid user. So that's why we need to be creating a user for all our node tests. That's just the way that I hooked it. And also, another big reason why I need to have a user is because if you look at my node model, I made my node model in a way, give me just 1 sec. So I made it in a way that if you check the user property of my node schema, it's linked to the user's database, the user's collection. So that is why I need to have a user. Otherwise, it won't let me create a new node without a valid user. So once that's set up, let's start by creating our new user. So let's do that right here. And that's, I think I forgot the globals. So let's make sure we have the globals for the test, because this time we will use them quite extensively as well. So let's insert them at this level. Those are our globals. Let's go back to our before each. So it creates a new user. It assigns the test user to the global. Then it assigns, once a created user is created, it stores the JSON web token that is created using that user. And it also stores the created user's ID, because we will need both of them to log in. Okay. Now, once we do finally have a valid user, only then we can create fake data on our database. So here where I'm creating 10 fake nodes. So I'm going to iterate over 10 times, create a new node. Then on that new node, inside the user property, I set the created user's ID. Remember how I told you we need a valid user to every node? So here we'll link them. The user we just created, we use that user's ID for every single new node we create. And then we use seedData.push to basically push all these new nodes into our seedData array. And then finally, we just do the node models insert many method, which allows us to just insert all these array objects and have some fake data we can work with. And that's about it. That's all we need so we can finally start writing some valid tests. So let's write our first test, which would be the most basic one of them all, which would be the returning of all the user's nodes. So that's super straightforward, thankfully. Let me copy it correctly because I did miss. There we go. So the way this works is quite simple. It makes a GET request to API/node. Note that because this is a protected endpoint, I need to set a JWT token. Now, the reason why I do need is because it's protected with JWT authentication. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at the node router. So my node router has JWT passport middleware, which I defined. If I take a look at where I defined that, it's right here. Here's where I defined it. Okay? And give me just 1 second. I want to disable something super quick, which is throwing all the errors you're seeing, all those red squiggly lines. There we go. We shouldn't be seeing them anymore. So yeah, basically you need to provide the authorization bearer JSON web token, otherwise you won't have access to this API endpoint. Once that's valid, you should be able to actually test things like check if the response has a status of okay, it's a JSON, and more importantly, it's an array. Question from Shivani: you have a graphical representation of data in your capstone. Should I test even this functionality? Is it possible because it's UI based? I think it would be possible, but it would be quite hard, to be honest. But there should be some NPM libraries which you can use to test UI and test HTML strings or graphs or whatever you have. So yeah, you should be definitely 100% possible to do it, but it's going to probably rely on you using other plugins or NPM libraries to do the testing. But yeah, totally, it should be possible. I hope that answers your question. But yeah, going back to this, notice how inside the request body we check that because we're fetching the API user nodes, we want to verify that we get at least one of them. But in this case, we should be getting 10 of them. We'll see soon enough. Then we make sure that these nodes are valid. So we extract the first node from the nodes array, and then we check that the keys match, that each node has a user, title, and content. We then check the node's user object to be sure it's an object, to make sure it includes keys like the name, email, and username. And there we go, it's debugging now. So let's add a quick breakpoint right here. There we go. So let's test this all. So notice our response.body is an array of nodes. These are all randomly generated, as you can see right here. So I'm going to extract the first node from the body. So it's just the first one, save it into the node variable, and then I do some tests into this node variable to check that it has the keys, to check that it's an object, to check that the nodes.userProperty has the name, email, and username fields, as you can see right here. And also to include, we also make sure that the owner of this node is the same one we created at the start. So we do to deep include and check that the properties match. So the test user we created at the start of our before each, we check and compare that it matches. This is kind of optional, but I don't know. I just want to go the extra mile here. But yeah, that's about it. This test should run, and it runs as expected. So let's finish up our last test, which will be the remaining endpoints. These ones are going to be also just more of the same. I think most of you should already have a good hang of this, because it's really I think it's a lot of repetition. Just creating a mock database, deleting the mock database, and just, constantly doing that for every single test. So this one we test to check if it can find a specific node. So in this one, we first use that raw mongoose model to find a node. Then we check that it does return the nodes. Then we fetch one node, and then we can actually finally chain a request to do. First, we do chai.request /API/node, then the found node's ID. Don't ever forget, because if it's protected by JWT authentication with Passport, you need to pass in the set authorization bearer JWT token. And then, because this returns a request, it gets chained, and that's why we can do then. This then applies to this one we just chained. So then, once this returns, we can actually check if the information matches. It's a JSON, it's an object, it has a keys, but more importantly, it compares that the item that was returned is indeed the originally found node at the start. So that's this test, and this should also run no problem. I'm just going to run it while I get the second test, which is going to be the updating of a node. So let me do that. There we go. Those are our tests running. So our next test would be creation of nodes. So node creation is something like this. So should create a specific node. Literally just create a new node data. Check that. Wait, hang on a second. I think I confused that one with the updating. Yeah, this one's that should update a node. So yeah, my mistake. So to update the node, I first find the node, I get the node I want to update, then I make a put request to the URL that I use to update nodes, send the authentication, and also send a new node data, which I created with Faker. Once this returns, then I expect the response to have a status code of null content, and to verify the update executed correctly, I return a new promise by doing node.findById using the mongoose model. I fetch the node to update's ID, and then I compare if the node that I retrieved does indeed match the data that I wanted to update originally. So it's a bit complex, but at the same time it still makes sense. It's a clear flow of verification and just making sure that things definitely work. Okay, so last but not least, let's test out our delete endpoint, which would be something like this. So let's test out our final endpoint, deletion. So how to test if should delete a specific node? Simple. As usual, use the mongoose model to do a .find. Then we extract a node we want to delete from the nodes list. We do a chai.request delete endpoint API/node/node to delete.id. Don't forget ever, if it's protected, send the authorization JSON web token. Remember, we always have this because in our before each of all these test files, if you go to the before each, every single time we run a test before it, we create a new user and we create a new JSON web token. That's a global that's available to all tests. That's why we can do this. So don't ever forget that. Let's go back to our test. So it tries to delete the node. Then it sends the new node data in case, I think this one is a mistake I made. I don't think I really need the new node data, but whatever. So then once that happens, we check that also it has a status of no content because that's what's replied when you do a delete successfully. And to verify we did delete the node, we make one last query, node.findById, and we verify that this node, when we try to make this request and then returns, we verify that node does not exist. Okay, so I think that should be clear enough. Let's try to run our tests one last time before we move on to continuous integration, which will be deploying this to Travis and getting this to show on Heroku. So let's do that right now. And there we go. So that's running. Let's add a new commit. So git add git status, git commit, added, tests during workshop. Let's do a push. Let's wait for that. There we go. That's live. So now we are finally ready to start tackling Travis. Now, to do that, I'm just going to, just to keep this maybe a bit more focused, I'm going to look at the server-side content of the course, and I'm going to follow the exact same instructions that Thinkful offers. So I'm going to go to the section on Travis, which would be here, continuous integration with Travis CI. So first step, I'm going to just ignore this step because I think it's easier to just jump right step into the creation of the travis.yaml file. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to go to the root of my project and create a new .travis.yaml file. Then inside of this file, you want to add this information to tell Travis that your app is a Node.js app. And also, this might sound redundant, but this just tells it the version of Node.js you want to use. Since you don't care, you just want to use the latest one, you write Node. Okay, that's set up. Now that that's done, let's make sure that's added to Git. So let's add everything. Git status. There we go. That's being tracked. And then we could be pushing this, and you know what? Let's push it. You know, who cares? But no, wait. I almost forgot. When you add MongoDB testing, because this does rely on a MongoDB database, you need to make sure you update your Travis file for that. So if you go to the continuous integration and deployment with Mongoose, you will notice that they cover how you should have added a new part in the services, this part here, to make sure that Travis knows that it needs to have MongoDB running for this to work. So that should actually be good. That should get Travis to show up. So let's make sure we commit this. So git commit -m add Travis integration. Let's do git push you GitHub master, and that should hopefully allow us or this project to show in Travis. So let's go to Travis now. Let's click on travisci.org. I think I'm already logged in. Yes, I am. So I'm going to go to my repositories. So go to settings, repositories. Let's find that just jotted testing. So just jotted. Where's testing? It should be somewhere here. Oh, it's in page 2, of course. Just jotted testing. Wait, where is it? That's weird. Oh, good call, Davey. Yeah, I think I definitely screwed that up. So let's sync from GitHub, and let's hope that gets it to show up. Seems like you already had that issue, and I wouldn't blame you. Let's try it out one more time. No, it's definitely doesn't look like it's there. The thing is, we have 2 repositories. The one we're working on is called... Wait a second. Why does it... Oh, it looks like I'm working on just Jotted, but I think this has more to do with the fact that the repository is actually called just Jotted testing. So if you don't believe me, just take a look at the commit history, and there you can see the commit we just made a while ago. So it should show as just Jotted testing. Let's figure out why it's not showing. Pretty curious. There we go. Finally, I think, yeah, we definitely had to click on sync account. So let's enable it. There we go. That's enabled. Let's push. I don't know. Let's just make a push so this updates it. Whatever. So let's just add a new line, save it, git add all, git commit, empty commit, git push. Don't worry about doing this push -u GitHub master. This is something I do because I have multiple, like, I have 2 remotes set up. I have GitHub master and Heroku, so don't worry about that too much. So yeah, that should work. There we go. So let's verify that it is working by just checking, refreshing our commit history. There we go. See that yellow button? That's great. That shows that Travis is now integrated into GitHub. So you can actually click that, and that takes you to the running Travis build. So you can see it either on your dashboard, like if you click home, it shows you you're running builds. And by the way, this is in real time. This is something I love about Travis. Like, notice how it updates in real time as it's setting up Node, it's installing all the dependencies you mentioned you need. And then after this is all installed, it will run our tests. And hopefully we'll get a green build and we can move on. Being happy. So while that's happening, let's just close this up and let's move into Heroku, because that's our next step. We want to deploy this to Heroku via Travis. And oh look, we do have a problem. The use of const in strict mode. That is interesting. Use of const in strict mode. It looks like it has to do something with Mocha. That's very interesting. Let's super quickly Google that out. So that's very weird. You know what? That's super weird, because I haven't never gotten this error. And the interesting tidbit is that it looks like it's not even our code that crashed. It's Mocha's. So literally Mocha crashed on Travis, saying that use of const in strict mode. I think this definitely has to do more with how Travis is running or Node version. So let's just search for this in Travis errors. So let's see how other people figure this out. As you can see, it's definitely not a rare issue. So let's see how people fixed it. Okay, that's not very helpful. It looks like it's applying to a different project. Great. Of all the types to have Travis issues in a workshop. Well, I guess at least now you can feel good that if you're getting Travis issues, happens to all of us. And this one definitely is stumping me. Why I'm getting a mock error in Travis? Maybe it's the Node version. NVM version? No, that's not it. What Node version is installing? It doesn't say what Node version it's using. What could be it? What could be it? I know. Maybe let's just search for Node Mocha and let's see if somebody already got this error while running Mocha, because this also seems similar. And let's cross our fingers. This updating Node.js. Oh, seriously? This is not exactly something we can do easily. Okay, I guess maybe I can just maybe we could just force it to use the latest Node version. So let's do that right now. Travis Node, and let's see how we set up the Node version. So let's just specify explicitly a Node version. Let's hope that fixes it. So language Node.js. Let's see. How do you set it to use a specific Node.js version? I think that was it. Node iOS LTS stable iOS release. Okay, that's not very helpful at all, but okay. Yeah, I think this is definitely going to take more than the time allows, so I think I'm going to really have to apologize with you guys for not being able to get this sorted out within the hour. But it definitely looks to me like it is a problem with how Travis is using the Node version. So right now we shouldn't even be getting this error because it's not on our side. Notice how it happens inside node modules /mocha/bin. So it has to do with the Node version we're using, probably, at least in my experience. And these errors sadly happen all the time. Like, I've had a lot of my students have problems with Travis deployments, and it's usually some kind of stupid thing, like you forgot to add something to Travis, you forgot to configure Travis with something it didn't like. Coming from Davi, can use Node LTS. I could try, but I'm not very confident that might work because LTS versions break a lot, and I actually never use LTS for that specific reason. But yeah, let's try it out while we just maybe have 5 minutes for questions. But yeah, to be honest, that should have worked. I'm going to see if I can figure this out. and I'm going to post why this didn't work on the Slack channel, either today or tomorrow. So keep a look on that if I can figure that out. But yeah, in the meantime, questions, thoughts. What did you guys think of the workshop? Enjoyed it? Did you enjoy it? I don't know. Anything, to be honest. Question from Davey: how thorough do you make your tests? It depends on the situation. Usually, if I'm writing tests, it's going to be as thorough as possible. So I'm going to write a ton of tests for almost every use case scenario I can write. The thing is, I do change that thoroughness depending on the criticality of the module. So if I'm adding tests for some critical business module at work, I'm going to add a crazy amount of tests for any single use case I can think of. But if it's something not very important, or that's not very prone to breaking, or if it breaks, there's not very that much of a consequence let me give you an example. Something that I wouldn't probably test too much could be, I can't think of anything right now. But yeah, I guess it would definitely depend. Right now, if I'll be honest with you, the test I wrote for this example, which, by the way, before I forget, you can find all of these tests on the fully completed app, along with some extra comments in some scenarios in this repository, which I'm going to link on the chat, and also the recording once I publish it. But the tests I wrote here are very, very bare bones. And by that, I don't mean that they aren't thorough. To be more specific, these are what we call in the professional world happy path testing. Happy path testing is what you do when you just test the happy path. Basically, when you just test things that they work as they should be, the perfect use case scenario, like a controlled environment, the perfect request. That's happy path testing. For critical components, we normally don't do just happy path testing. We test other things if they can break. Like, for example, what happens if you try to log in with just the username? What happens if you try to log in with just the password? What happens if you insert some super weird characters into the password field, including non-Unicode standard characters? What happens if you enter a user with 1,000 characters, 1,000,000 characters, 2,000,000 characters? So that's non-happy path testing. And that's something that you will be doing once you go live. But for the purposes of learning, I honestly just settle for happy path testing because testing is quite challenging. It was a challenge for me, honestly. So I don't think the best way of teaching you guys how to test is just to overburden you with a dozen of tests, a dozen of non-happy path tests, because it's cool and all that you show that you can do it, but it includes it's just too much work, and the capstones are already very, very limited in the time that they give you. And question from Davi: does that include edge test cases? Yes, those would be non-happy path test cases. But yeah, hope that answers your question. Anybody else? And also, before you leave, as previously, if it's possible, I'm going to send you guys a super quick feedback form. So this one is only 4 questions. These are just rating from 1 to 10. To tell me if you enjoyed the session. Maybe I thought I did good, maybe I didn't. And I would love to know what you guys think. Maybe there's something I can improve, and that's what I'm all about, improving these things. So if you really valued the time I put into this, because it was also quite a bit, just adding all the tests and getting this project up to speed that you can actually see live, if you could give me 1 or 2 minutes of your time, I would insanely appreciate it. Just answering that super quick feedback form to let me know what you thought, anything you thought could have been done better, or even letting me know if there was something you'd like to see on our new workshop. Now, finally, question from Shivani. Sorry, I just noticed you raised your hand.
Hi. Actually, I have one silly doubt. When writing this test case, expect to be and to have. I'm confused. What words to use. I mean, is it any way to remember? To have a status or something like that.
Yes, I had that problem as well. I'll be honest with you. I hate Mocha for this exact reason, because I can't remember what words to use either.
Yeah,
it was made to be English readable, but it made it harder for me. So, I'm 100% with you. What you can do in those type of cases is literally do what I do. Look up the official documentation. So,
okay.
Oh. Oh, thank you, Adriana. Yes, totally. I sent the wrong link. Oh, silly me. Let me send the actual feedback form. Dang it. Thank you so much for letting me know. Thanks. Now, the question was, oh yes, how to remember the syntax. Yes, what I like to do. Oh, yep. Want to say something?
Like the documentation.
Yes, I like to check the chai assertion documentation. Here you can actually read about it, and also I like to do some reading of my own. So I just Google chai cheat sheets, and also this is one of my favorite links of all time. Let me find it. I think it was Dev2. Was it Dev2? Let me find that. Cheat sheets. Dev hints. That was a link. So Dev hints is a master cheat sheet repository, and I'm fairly certain they do have something on chai. There we go. There's chai. So these has all the most common chai assertions. And it gives them to you in all the assertion styles. So I like to use the expect syntax because I don't know, just gotten used to it. There's no preference. There's nothing bad about any of these syntaxes. But for example, if you want to use the expect syntax, here are the most common ones, like to equal, to deep equal, to be, to include, to be okay, to be true, to be false, to be null, to be undefined, blah 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 blah. And these are just more for quick reference. But if you want to actually learn about these, what I would do is definitely just Google it, like literally Google it. So chai expect to equal, and we can see the first thing should probably give us that link. But if you have a question between to equal versus to equal, which by the way, this was one of my questions while working with chai, first result, this is the great thing about coding. Like, it's so overdone that it's highly unlikely that you have a question that nobody has ever made before. So you will probably just find the answer to whatever question you have a quick Google search away. And as you can see here, search for equal. There you go. These are all the assertions you can do. And it even gives you clear examples of how to do it. And it actually gives them very in-depth examples of how you would test multiple objects with each syntax. So I think this is probably definitely you might want to use.
Sure, thank you.
No worries. And you're welcome, Maples. Glad you enjoyed it, and have a good night.
Good night. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? I think we have time for one last question. Oh, and the recording will be published to the Slack channel once it's live. Nobody? Oh, you're welcome, Adriana. Yeah, I thought that would be a good idea, and I think it definitely helps because you'd be surprised. I think easily 90% of the issues that at least my students have had with getting their unit test to run could have all been super easily sorted out by just debugging the code and seeing why the test was being false. But yeah, debugging is awesome. I honestly don't think I could live without it. I would hate my life if I couldn't debug things, to be honest. But yeah, I guess no questions then. So I guess we'll wrap up the session here. You can find the full code up live in the GitHub link I already sent you all. I plan to add a lot more comments to it. I know the tests and the front end are lacking comments. Reason is this took a long time to build, like easily over 12 hours. And I kind of rushed it, to be honest, during this week. So I didn't have enough time to just add the test. Like, I barely finished the front end yesterday, literally yesterday. So I didn't have time to add any comments because I just wanted to have this fully functional and also implementing as many best practices as I could. So that if you wanted to take a peek at the code once the workshops were live, you would not be surprised with any nasty code. So I will be adding comments maybe during next week probably. And also be on the lookout if you're having trouble with the front end wire up. I will probably do part 3, which is wiring up the front end, basically the back end of the app to the front end and actually building the front end, along with a lot of very good best practices on how to build application front ends according to modern standards. So be on the lookout to that. It will probably be on Wednesday or Thursday. So yeah, I guess thank you everybody for assisting, and I will be seeing hopefully some of you on my next session. All right? Cool. Take care, everybody. Have a good night. Bye-bye.